there, gang. I'm going to do some work today on an older guitar from the land of the rising sun. This is a Morris, which doesn't sound like a very Japanese name. There's a story behind that. I've seen a number of Morrises over the years. To me, they kind of represent the duality at play in Japanese guitar manufacturing. The founder of Morris is a fellow named Toshio Morihira, who had a music store and distributorship in the 1960s. His was apparently the very first company in Japan to be an authorized dealer of both Fender and Gibson, which was a good thing to be in 1960s Japan. I think the Venture's Japanese fan club had like 3 million people in it at the time. So, he was doing pretty good. In 1964, he was allowed to visit the Gibson factory in Kalamazoo and picked up some ideas. And one of the employees there nicknamed him Mori, which is what eventually inspired the name choice. In '67, he decides to found his own manufacturing company, and they start building pretty close copies of Martin and Gibson guitars for the domestic market in Japan. A few years after that, in the '70s, he's ready to enter the US market. And this was the era of lawsuit guitars. Ibanez and various other companies building clones, essentially, varying in quality depending on the price. Morris made stuff that was sort of mid to high grade within that world. But the thing is, Morris's domestic production was some serious high grade merchandise. They had great woods, excellent craftsmanship. Their plant was in Hokkaido, near the mountains, and it was a pretty big plant. They also made acoustics for Ibanez and Washburn and various other makers, and eventually got into like the thin body acoustic electrics as well. That's where the duality lies. In America, guitar manufacturers have always sort of aimed for a certain segment of the market. Could be the top, the middle, or the bottom. At the top you have Martin. Everyone else sort of fits themselves into a rung on the ladder. It was different in post-war Japan, where a manufacturer was expected to have a range of models that encompassed the entire spectrum, from most basic plywood box to the upper reaches of bespoke quality. You had to provide for every segment of the market in order to be considered a proper manufacturer. They realized that Americans viewed Japanese guitars as being cheap and cheerful, so with that being expected, that is exactly what they produced for export. Japanese quality means something different today, and that's now what they're offering, They're showing a different price range. It's all very stratified. So we're going to see if we can get this into some good working condition. These tend to be a little heavier in construction than, say, the Yamaha guitars of the 1970s. Some interesting features. First is the top wood, which I don't think is Sitka spruce. This might be one of the domestic Japanese spruces from Hokkaido. Second is the finish on the top, which has taken on sort of a ghostly white sunburst effect, which would not have been original. I think this has to do with maybe the thickness of the coating in certain areas. And it's probably a polyvinyl finish, similar to the one that Fender was using at that time. Because when these check or develop cracking in the finish, they tend to be long, heavy cracks rather than tight little rectangles. Often the edges of a guitar pick up more lacquer than the center, and this has opacified into this burst effect, which is really kind of cool. Interestingly, that has not happened at all to the back and sides. It's as if a completely different finish has been used. And this is the kind of thing that could happen in Japan. There are a couple of accounts of Western luthiers who visited Japan to get lines of, say, student-grade instruments made. Richard Brunet being one of them. And he came away with some really interesting impressions of the building process and how strange some of the decision-making could be. So, if it was thought that one material was better suited for use on the soundboard and another was better for the back and sides, that's what they would do. Even if commercially it maybe wasn't the best choice, from an economic standpoint. So there are lots of places where means of production are kind of at odds with the quality of the final product. I've mentioned seeing this before in some really rock-bottom El Cheapo guitars that have immaculately inset bracing that was done with chalk fitting, which you would find in, say, a violin restoration workshop. Made no sense, but that's what they thought was best, so they'd do it. Have a look at how deeply the fret slots were cut into the fingerboard. That's twice what they need to be. And on the fingerboard extension, it seems that material was removed from the bottom side of the board after slotting to make fitting it to the top easier. We tend to lose the position markers there at the bottom where they're centered for the rest of the neck. The string action is a little high on this guitar. It's around 7/64 on the bass, a little over 5 on the treble. I was discussing with the owner whether it needs a neck reset, and I said I wanted to work on it for a little bit before making that decision. The saddle is wide, far wider than what I'd consider standard for dreadnoughts of this design. It's a full 5mm or 3/16 of an inch. What might save us is the neck is considerably bowed. There's like 23 thousandths relief at the 6th fret, which is at least 3 times more than we need. And if we're lucky and the truss rod functions, I expect we won't need to reset it, which would be very good news for the owner, because again, don't know how this neck was put on. Of course, we have to temper expectations about what truss rods can do. This owner actually had a family member attempt to straighten the neck on another of his guitars, snapped the rod right off. See, the grain direction in the neck block is running perpendicular to the sides, which is not standard. It's not what you find on a Martin or a Gibson. It's atypical. So I don't know if a dovetail was used in this or whether it was dowels or some mortise and tenon or something, but it gives me pause. Okay, I've loosened the string tension right off here, so I've got nothing fighting me. And this actually takes a 5mm hex key rather than the 4 that you find in a lot of import guitars these days. So it's slightly beefier. I'll give it a try to... Wow, it's tight. I'm loosening the nut right now. Yeah. Very tight. Ugh. So yeah, that was as tight as that truss rod could ever be. Another quarter turn and it would have snapped. So didn't gain anything on the action height, can't reduce the relief in the neck. Which I think the next thing to do is probably try the heat press and see if that'll gain us anything. Because I'm kind of, I wouldn't really want to do a neck reset if we can't straighten the neck. Because this amount of up bow, it never feels right, it never plays properly in the center portions of the neck. It would just sort of be kind of wasting time to reset the neck otherwise. And gut feeling is, of course, that this would not be a problem if the fret slots hadn't been cut so incredibly deep. That just loosens the fretboard up in ways that you don't want to deal with. You don't want any more than it takes to house the frets tang, because it's just, you're robbing stiffness out of the neck, and it comes back to bite you eventually. Yeah, so there's like 22, 23 thousandths relief on the surface of the board with no string tension on. It's kind of a sad place to start. So I've got my neck heater device set up and plugged in here into my DC power supply. This is going to heat up, and over the next few minutes I'll tighten the clamp here to put the neck into a back bow and let that cook for about 45 minutes or an hour. I'll turn it off and let it sit overnight, and that'll help set the bend. And hopefully we'll end up with a condition that is in, something of a slight back bow or perfectly straight. Of course, I've loosened the truss rod before putting this thing together. I want to make sure there's movement for us to go forward or backward when we reach the end point. This stayed clamped up for a day and ended up basically having it. It's around 11 or 12 thousandths relief in the center of the board now, which is not good. I want it straight. So I'll give it another try with thicker shims so I can bend the board more. I don't suspect I'll get that much out of it, but we'll see what we can do. So I'm going to be bending this neck a tremendous amount. Scary, almost. Like 100 thousandths, which is 2.5 millimeters. it's a lot. When I first built the heater, I tried to come up with a formula that would let me predict how much spring back I could expect, but I've since learned that it's a waste of time because every neck is so different. Similar necks will respond in completely different ways. So I'm going to clamp this up with a whole lot of shim. Okay, so after the second treatment, we're still at 11 thousandths. That seems to be the baseline. It doesn't want to move more than that, so that's as good as it's going to get. Many of the fret tops, especially in the lower positions, were quite flat and had some dings in them, so I had to do some recrowning and leveling. Okay, I put some 12 to 54s on this, and with the truss rod, again, cranked back up to its absolute maximum, we now have a neck relief of 12 thousandths. That's okay. That's the most I would ever want to see, but it's alright. With the heat press, the action has actually come down to 6/64ths on the bass side, 4 on the treble. And again, that's decent action. It's factory spec for many makers. Looking at the saddle, there are a couple of areas of concern. You see how the windings on the bass E have come up and over the top. On most guitars, this means that the ball end of the string has chewed through the bridge plate below. I'm not so sure in this case. It may be related to this extra wide saddle, which I think was a repair made to accommodate an under-saddle pickup. It's got a piezo on this thing. The pinholes are actually in pretty good shape, and there's nothing too out of the ordinary on the inside here. It all looks very familiar. There's also a little bit of a crack here in the bridge top, and though we have good action, there really isn't sufficient break angle for the high E and B. I can improve that by lengthening the string slots, moving the point at which the string exits the bridge closer to the back of the saddle, thereby increasing the angle. What about the neck reset? Well, the saddle is low, but we've got good playable action now, and I'm leaning against it. Something tells me that this neck is doweled on. First of all, we have that vertical grain in the neck block. We also have a condition where the neck was installed before the finish was sprayed on. There's a lot of lacquer in the corner here between neck and body. Now that's not a definitive, because Gibson also used to do that all the time with their dovetailed necks. But I've seen this in too many Japanese doweled necks to kind of ignore it. So what's the big deal? I can cut the lacquer and heat it up and pull it right off, right? Maybe. If it's epoxied on, that can take a whole lot of pulling. And because of the long truss rod in this guitar, you can't really rock this back and forth in order to get it moving. How about just cutting it off flush and doing the Kung Fu neck reset? Well, again, the truss rod is in the way. I can't cut all the way through unless I also remove a big chunk of fingerboard to get access and cut from both sides, which it gets messy. The Kung Fu neck reset is really only for catalog guitars from the 30s and 40s that are worth basically nothing that someone wants to play, because there's nothing in the way of me cutting them off. So let me see how well I can make this play before getting into all that funny business, because we're in that area again where these were never expected to be taken apart for repair, and they really don't lend themselves to it in the way that a Harmony, a Martin, or a Gibson does. I'd really like to cut this bridge down a little bit on the treble side, gain an extra 32nd of an inch or something there, but this is so black and so shiny that I expect it's actually been lacquered, and it's probably not ebony. It's, in which case you're refinishing the entire bridge. Having removed the saddle, which is pretty nicely made, we see the braided strip of a piezo pickup and what appears to be a few shims. I don't like multiple shims. Every gap provides a place for you to lose string energy before it even reaches the soundboard. And I know there are manufacturers who do this. To me, it says that they don't actually care how their guitars sound. It's not a good idea. So I'm going to replace this with a single shim. And here we have definitive proof that the bridge was painted. It actually smells to me like Indian rosewood when I drill through it. they had to pretend it was ebony. So I'll fill the crack here with multiple passes of thin super glue. And I'll use the rotary tool to lengthen the slots. Here I'm planing the new saddle shim to width and to height. And checking frequently with a pair of calipers. They're really handy for this kind of work. That fits well. I'll lightly sand and buff up the area where I had filled the crack. So, philosophical time again. I talked to the owner, who lives some distance away, which doesn't make this kind of thing easy. I explained the situation. The action is as good as it can possibly be. It's about 17 or 18% lower than when it arrived. It's easier to play, but it's not perfect. It really could use more saddle height. I said, do you want me to stop now? You know, you're just going to pay for the heat press and a bit of a setup. Or do you still want me to go crazy on this thing and rack up the big bucks, making it good for the next 30 years? And he's game, which kind of surprised me. You know, it's his guitar. It's the one for him, right? And the new plan is to take off the entire fingerboard, cut the neck free, route channels and glue carbon fiber strips into the neck while clamping it straight. Convert the thing to a bolt-on, reset the neck. Yes, all of this work is worth as much or more than the resale value. You know, sometimes you have to do a preliminary fix and see how good you can make something with the bare minimum before coming to this kind of conclusion. He said he's been assembling cars for a lot of years. It's taken a toll on his hands, so lower action is good. And it would be nice to know that this thing can always be adjusted in the future. So, here we go. Watching this footage in retrospect, I'm screaming at myself to stop. Here I'm scoring a line along the fingerboard to neck junction. I'll blast it with heat and try to separate the two. And it was not cooperative. Like, the heat was doing nothing, and it was mostly just me forcing the knife through. Well, that did not pan out. The epoxy used to glue the fingerboard on is not sensitive to heat, at least in the ranges I can provide. The rosewood was starting to scorch, and it did virtually nothing. I was struggling along there for an hour, pushing and prodding with the palette knives, and I did get about a third of it loose. But I reached a point where the blades were starting to dive down into the neck wood proper because of grain direction, and it's like, well, there's a point of no return. And I decided to return. You have to let intuition guide you sometimes, and I could see it going very wrong if I, continued and blew out a big piece of mahogany or something. Mixing up some G2 epoxy here, which is, it's designed for use with oily or resinous woods like rosewood, but it's a good epoxy. A long open time, very strong stuff. Have to mix it for an awful long time though, to make sure things are really well combined. There's the glue up. Well, that didn't pan out either. This is pretty much the worst experience I've had with a repair in a very, very long time. Why, you say? What's going on? How about the epoxy didn't cure? Right now this thing is full of a viscous fluid, the consistency and with the adhesive qualities of applesauce. Every once in a while someone will send me a message in the middle of the night asking if I ever mess up a repair to the point where it can't be fixed, which is a wonderful thing to wake up to and begin your day with. This is one of those. There was a brief interval yesterday when I should have just stopped and said, hey, it's playable. That's 17%. It's just, it is what it is. But what I'm left with now is a neck that is not straight, that has a maxed out truss rod, that has several small splits in it, and is completely contaminated with sticky, uncured epoxy. It was a fresh batch of epoxy. I measured it the way I always do. I mixed it for a full 3 minutes, So what now? I can't hand this back to the customer. It was at least functional when he brought it in, you know. And repairing it is, I'm going to call it impossible, practically speaking. I think the responsible thing to do is to re-neck it and eat the extra cost. Now, I'm told I'm pretty good at replicating neck profiles, and I have a supply of first-class materials. So if I do that, I can correct the original issues, give him a functional truss rod, and it will be as good, and frankly, not to be boastful, with the carbon fiber inserts and shallow fret slots and an over-under rod, it'll be better than the original. This is not my preferred outcome, but sometimes things do go wrong, and you have to be prepared to do what it takes, right? So we'll turn this into a two-part episode, and next week I'll show you guys how I go about duplicating a neck. Thanks for watching. We'll see you then.